It's my pleasure to welcome to the Today's Leader podcast, the podcast for the leaders and the entrepreneurs of today. Please welcome Jodie Woelkerling. Now, have I said that right, Jodie?
You have. Well done. Thank you, Tony, and thank you very much for having me on.
It's a pleasure to have you. And you're from Victoria, and so I've got another Australian on the podcast. It's always exciting to be speaking with another leadership coach, development, someone aspiring to teach our leaders to be better right here in Australia. So share with us, Jodie, the Jodie Woelkerling story.
Oh, okay. So I'll start with sort of what I do in terms of my work. I specialise in resilience. So that's from a couple of different perspectives. So from an individual perspective, it's about helping people to build their own resilience so that when they have stresses in their life, and we all do, it's a part of modern life, that they are in the position to be able to handle them well. They don't have the negative effects that are associated with stress, whether that's things like health effects or mental functioning, all that sort of stuff. So I work with people as group training in building their resilience, but also a lot of the time on one-on-one coaching, which is just an amazing process.
Absolutely.
And I love it. But it's about, it's about them, the things that are their challenges and their goals, and helping them build their resilience. So that's from the individual point of view. I also work with leaders in terms of how to lead in a way that their team will be more resilient to the stresses, and also from a business cultural perspective, so that there's a culture that is set up and enhanced that is more, conducive to being more resilient to stress for the people within
Excellent.
the culture.
So has that always been your background, or did you come out of a corporate role?
Yep. So I've spent most of my working life in the corporate role, generally in positions of authority, responsibility, leadership. Now, I actually found for most of my working life, I was very adversely affected by stress, and for a lot of it really wasn't even aware. But I was one of these people who stress was a constant overhang, and I had this wrong point of view, which I see in a lot of people, that it's almost this, I need to be on edge in order to perform properly. It is so wrong, but that is a lot of what I used to think. And then a few years back, I kind of hit a point where I was very, very close to burnout myself, and my stress was affecting me physically, mentally, relationships, I got to the point of going, my gosh, there must be something better than this. And then started on a journey with lots of courses and lots of self-education, and that almost naturally transferred into, okay, this is something that's so powerful, I need to teach other people and help other people.
Excellent. And I hear that story so often, don't we, that people are taking their experiences out of the corporate space and into the private sector space, I suppose, for themselves to teach people how they've been able to work with these particular things. You made a statement there in relation to the pressure, and there's almost an expectation that we need to have some pressure in our corporate lives, or that we, as a leader and a manager, we do want to stretch and pressure our people. But there's a big difference between stretching and challenging to constant pressure, isn't there? Can you define that a little bit clearer for us?
Okay, so there's are you familiar with the stress curve?
No, and
it's pretty much what you just described. So if we look at stress levels, if you look at like a bell-shaped curve, the very start of it on the left is I'm sitting on the couch watching Netflix. There's no stress, but there's also very little performance. So that's your resting, recovering kind of state. So as the stress levels go up, your performance actually goes up. So you're absolutely spot on. A certain degree of pressure, so things like KPIs, deadlines, that sort of stuff, is good and results in people performing well. The issue comes is when you get to the top of that
Yeah.
bell curve. So all the way up that bell curve, as the stress increases, the performance increases. When you get to a situation of either very high levels of stress or very prolonged levels of stress without breaks, then it goes to the other side of the bell curve, which is where things like fatigue, disenchantment, in really serious cases, things like burnout and just total fatigue kicks in. So you're spot on. Certain degree of stress is actually productive. Too much of it or too prolonged, it is very, very much counterproductive.
Very much so. And, once again, from my experience, I've also been coaching rugby league teams. I know rugby league's a little bit foreign to you people in Victoria, but
Aussie rules.
But part of getting the most out of your team is to actually put them under, put them into those pressured situations within the training paddock that's going to help them acclimatise and perform in those pressured situations on the field. And there's so much that we can take out of how we train and coach our sporting teams and what we can do with that within the corporate space. One of the interesting things that I always find with people when it comes to, say, pressure and stress, and a lot of the times we also put pressure on. We put pressure on ourselves, don't we? So I always talk about the Eisenhower Matrix, and quadrant 1 is urgent and important, and a lot of people focus on that, and they focus on things like deadlines and whatnot. But most of the dramas that they put themselves under is because if something's due on a Friday, they say, "Oh well, I'll work on it on a Friday," instead of saying, "I'm going to work on it on a Wednesday so that I get plenty of time to get it fixed." So when you start working with someone in relation to resilience, right? So how is it, what's the process that you utilize to help them navigate and develop and increase their resilience?
So you're talking from a personal, their own resilience.
So someone's come to you and they've heard that you're a coach that works with people to develop their resilience. Walk me through some of the processes that you would use.
Yep. So I work on 3 levels, and all 3 of these are very, very important. So the first level is when somebody is feeling stressed. There are the stress reaction in a lot of cases is a biological reaction. So there's things that actually happen biologically. So that goes back to the origin of stress is the life or death. I'm in front of a saber-toothed tiger. How can I get myself out of this? So there's physiological things that happen when you're stressed. So by teaching people, there's certain techniques and tricks that when they're feeling stressed to bring themselves back to calm is enormously powerful. It's not the be all and end all, and it's not a total solution, but it is really important. So when someone's feeling stressed, and part of that obviously is them recognizing that they're stressed, because for a lot of people they're not even really aware of that. So they recognize they're stressed and then doing some of these physiological things to bring themselves back to calm. So that's the first level. The second level, there's a lot of lifestyle and mindset things that have an enormous influence on our ability to manage stresses in our life. So basic things like diet, exercise, sleep, ways of processing things, so things like journaling or talking to people, work-life balance. There's a whole stack of them. They can make an enormous difference in the way people deal with stresses in their lives. So I work with people on those, and mindset kind of fits into that category as well. So there's certain things like people's inner voice, how they talk to themselves, how they reframe when things go wrong. It's a whole series of mindset things that can make an enormous difference. Yep, and the third level, which is the one I find the most interesting and the one that almost gives the biggest, I call them aha moments for the client, are these subconscious underlying things. Now, often they will relate back to something that's happened in childhood, so they are underlying beliefs, decisions, perceptions of yourself or the world. There's a whole, and it is so individual, but I find, it is probably the most interesting thing for me to do with people, and it's one of the reasons why I love coaching so much, but it is also the most impactful, because sometimes there can be something that's holding someone back and they have no idea about it. So it's getting to that and then helping them to reset so that it's not holding them back anymore. So that's a very long-winded answer, but that's
an excellent answer, because you really mapped out that strategy and that process really well. One of the blind spots that people have, and we all have them, and it was interesting where I met a coach for the first time probably 6 years ago when I started my own journey of going into this space, and I was having a conversation with her after an event, and I said something that was like what I would say was a self-depreciating comment. I've forgotten the comment, what I actually said. And she said, there's a blind spot there, Mr. Curl, she says. And I said, well, maybe there was. So those awareness things are always key and critical for me. So when I'm going to go back to the sporting analogy. So with a sporting team, I'm going to put them under some pressure during a training session so that they can cope with pressure during the course of the game. And I'm always reminded of one of the mentors that I had in my corporate life, a gentleman called Brian Menke, who talked about coping strategies. So he was quite an unfit, unwell, unhealthy sort of a person, and he took up running. Lost a heap of weight, his performance improved markedly. There's a whole range of positive stories to come out of that particular one. And Brian would always talk about coping strategies. So now his coping strategy was that he runs and he deals with it, whereas before what he was doing was obviously going home and having some unhealthy habits. So is that part of the process as well, helping people prepare for the stress before it happens? So having those coping strategies that they can call upon in the time of need.
Absolutely. So I'm big on things like visualization. So as a preparation, so you visualize whatever you're doing going well. So if I put it in the context of currently, I sit before I do a podcast, I sit and kind of visualize it all going well. I'm very keen. It makes an enormous difference. Well, for me personally, It makes an enormous difference. And then if they are feeling stressed and they're in that stress position, you're absolutely right. There are different coping mechanisms. So, for example, with COVID particularly, apparently when it first hit, alcohol sales went through the roof. So people's coping mechanism in this unknown situation was to drink more, and for other people it was eat more and that sort of stuff. So definitely developing coping strategies that are going to be productive for you in the short and the long term rather than those unproductive coping. Does that answer your question?
And I guess also what we've seen with COVID is because we are allowed out to exercise, a lot of people who previously haven't exercised have suddenly said, well, I need to get out, so I'm going to go for a walk or go for a run. So, but I agree, there's a lot of people, and myself included, that are carrying a couple of COVID kilos that we need to sort of knock out and get back into shape. And it was interesting, Jodie. My wife and I ran the Australian Outback Marathon recently, and one of the interesting things I found was that, when you're in the Australian Outback, it's just silence and it's still and it's just magical. And I normally run with music, and I didn't run with music on this particular time, and it was delightful. It was really good just to be in the silence and the stillness. Now, Sharon still had her music on because she can't run without the music, but I just found it an absolutely peaceful process of actually running through the outback in silence and stillness. And, and that's now going to form part of my game in relation to how I can improve my running as well. Just not always have the music in the ear, or listening to a podcast or whatever it may be. So, but when people have that exercise ability, they can, and they know that at the end of a stressful day at work, and let's face it, most of our days are going to have some level of stress, unless, of course, you're hiding under the desk or hiding under the radar. Knowing that you're going to go out and enjoy something, whether it's going to the gym, doing your F45, or going for a run, and not just opening up the fridge and pulling out a beer, I think is always going to be something positive. So, and that's something that you work with as well.
Yes, definitely. There's lifestyle things. I mean, it's interesting what you're talking about with your running. Meditation is one of the lifestyle things that I talk about, and I actually talk about walking a lot of the times as meditative. So walking with no sound. So it's the running version. I guess that's my slant coming in, because I'm more of a walker than a runner. So, but yes, it has almost that meditative, because it's rhythmic and repeated, and a lot of the time it's in silence. It's can be enormously relaxing. So creating those things in your life that bring you back to that state of calm, and it's a very personal thing as to what works for you. But absolutely, rather than opening the fridge, grabbing a beer, going, I feel terrible, I'm going to get takeaway, or I'm going to eat a block of chocolate, or finding those things that will actually work for you in the long term as well.
So something that's therapeutic, as opposed to something that you may need therapy from, whether it might be a way to look at it. So if you're called in, let's talk about some of those harder style leaders that no doubt you've come across in some of the work that you've done, who probably subscribe to the theory that, they might be a little bit of command and control. They may be focused on results. They may be a very strong high D, if we're going to use the DISC profile as a bit of a method here. They may be a high D style leader, and part of their belief system is about putting their team under pressure, or being very clear about expectations, which can sometimes then increased expectations, increased standards. And I'm saying that's all part of business anyway. We've got to deliver value as a leader. So how do you work with someone like that, who may have very firm beliefs entrenched that it's their role to put their team under pressure, and they don't necessarily see what they're doing as putting them under more pressure or extreme pressure, or even to the extent of maybe bullying and harassment? So how do you work with someone like that?
Yeah. Such a good question. So one thing, if we're talking about coaching, because one of the things in terms of coaching that I do is leadership coaching. When I first talk with somebody who's a potential coaching client, before they're signed up as a coaching client, I have a pretty straight talking conversation with them. And one of the things in that is, this will only work if you and I are both on board. So there's no point going into a coaching where somebody is resistant to change, resistant to developing on their own shortfalls. So I guess I don't have it that much as a problem, because I set the premise up front. And if they at that point go, this is not something for me, then we don't go ahead, and I'm absolutely fine with that. Coaching will only work if the client or the coachee is on board and is looking to work through their issues. And I tell you what, it can be a very confronting process, because it's dealing with core behaviours, core beliefs. So I don't have it as a problem that much, because if they're not on board, we don't proceed. And it's interesting, people can surprise you. There can be people who come across as very... I'll call it old school. So that's kind of what you described, the older style of leadership. Old school, but when you explain to them, okay, this is the effect that this has on your staff. This is what the research says around how people respond. All that sort of stuff, and actually explain it to them and get them to self-analyse. So, okay, say that there's been a particular incident that we're debriefing. You go, okay, let's have a look at this from your employee's point of view. How do you think that's made for, if you pretend you're the employee, how would that make you feel? How do you think, if that was you, how would you respond, that sort of stuff? And as I said, people can, even the most sort of old school manager, depending on how you present it, and how you get them to really think about it, it can, as I said, coaching is one of the most powerful processes I've come across, because it really does get to that core issue, core goal.
I've had to work with some real, what I would call hard-ass managers in my time. I have done coaching previous for contracting to organisations, and they'll just assign you a group of leaders, and some of them are delightful to work with and really want to improve, while others see it as a clear imposition in their day. You know, how dare I have to spend an hour with you, or whatever the case may be. And it's always those little wins that you have with those that keep you going in some respects as a coach. So how do I rephrase this? What's the question I'm going to ask here that's going to get that engagement or that buy-in or that aha moment? And I find that a fascinating part of my particular personal journey. So no doubt with yourself. So talking about journeys, who's inspired you in your leadership journey?
It's interesting, probably more than anybody. Are you familiar with Jack Canfield? Okay. I'm a big fan of Jack Canfield and his success principles, and I'm a certified trainer in his success principles as well. I just find his teachings to be very powerful in their simplicity. Now, what I mean by that is there's a lot of principles of success. Most of them are really quite easy to understand. So things like know your purpose, take responsibility for yourself, know what you want. They're basic principles, but you put them together and adopt them as a life path. They're life-changing. So he's probably, when I think about it, out of everybody who I've kind of studied or in person had influence from, he's probably been the biggest inspiration,
And it's interesting, you're talking about some of those success principles, and, you know, they seem common sense or commonplace, but so many people actually don't know what it is that they want. And that's one of the key basic questions to ask. And it almost sounds too simple, doesn't it? I'm going to ask that question. And so many people, it's when I was doing recruitment with Bunnings, one of the first questions I'd ask people, just to get them feeling and just get them talkative before we go into the behavioural style questions, would be, tell me about some of the goals that you've set for yourself this year. And most of the people are very general. I just want to be a better person. I just want to be get into a better job. I just want to earn some more money. And that's not goal setting. That's like wishing, or just, so some of those key principles of you've got to know what you want is really, really critical for any sort of success. So Jack Canfield is certainly one of those people that have been able to articulate that in a way that's beneficial for people. So is that also the book that's had the most impact on you? Yeah.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. My journey with learning Jack's things started with the book, and then it sort of gravitated to, I want to actually know this better, and trained and qualified as a teacher.
Excellent. A very similar story. The very first leadership book I ever picked up was the Leadership Gold book by John Maxwell, and I found it in one of those bargain basement bins. I think it was like $2, and I would have picked that up probably 15 years ago now, I'm pretty certain. Still got the original copy, and it's been thumbed through that many times, but it just got me thinking, and just the way John detailed some of those really key critical learnings in a way that was, sometimes humorous, really caught my eye, that leadership doesn't necessarily need to be this serious trait. We can learn from a little bit of humour and personal touch. And I think those personal stories we share are really critical in how we create better leaders. So when you look back at some of those great leaders in the past and, the inspiration, do you see the traits that you see in those great leaders in the past, are they the same traits that we need for today's leaders?
Oh, that's a big question. I think the world's changing. There were some very serious cracks that were showing before COVID, and COVID has just highlighted them. I think, to answer your question, I think today's leaders need different skills to maybe a leader 20 years ago. They need a lot more of, it used to be called soft skills. To me, it's human skills. So things like setting up environments where people are able to excel, not going, well, that's the process, you need to fit into it. So empowering people to actually do well, because it's like the opposite of the old carrot and stick kind of process. Most people instinctively, they want to be part of a bigger vision and a bigger purpose, and they want to do their job well. You don't usually really need the carrot and the stick as long as you have the right environment. So, to answer your question, I think it is quite different to before, and it's a lot more important that leaders have those, as I said, soft skills they used to be called. So things like emotional intelligence, where they actually are really in tune with themselves and how they emotionally deal with things and process things, but also from a emotionally connecting with and empathizing with the people in their teams. Because if they come from that perspective, they're going to set up things in a way that is more human-centered and more, as I said, empowering your team to actually do their job well. Because often when that's not the case is when you get things like disengagement and staff retention issues.
And once again, research continues to show that highly engaged people are, anywhere up to 20% more productive, more effective. And, that concept of soft skills is, I always talk about them actually being the hardest skills. So, if they were easy, everyone would be doing it. So, and one of my previous guests said she was certain that the person that labelled them soft skills only did so because they realised how hard they were and they didn't want anyone else doing them. So, which I thought was quite humorous. So that's pretty cool. So during our journeys, we have our inevitable peaks. We also have our inevitable troughs. We also have those times where we stare at this thing called failure. So talk me through your journey and how you've worked with that concept. What's your relationship with failure?
Oh, I love that question. As you said, everybody's gone through setbacks and everybody's gone through failure of some sort. I guess the key thing is how you, and this is probably a Jack Canfield overlap as well, the key thing is how you respond to it. So if you see failure as a learning experience, so you either win or you learn. See failures or setback as a learning, as a keep on going, as okay, that's something that didn't work for whatever reason. Okay, how can I do it differently next time? And realise that, we are all human. We are all going to make mistakes. We are all going to behave really badly at times. And that's part of being human. So realise that it's part of the learning process, and also in that have compassion for yourself, because it's a very human thing to, especially if it's around behaviour or you've hurt somebody or you've acted in a way that you're not proud of. It's very easy to be self-defeating in your response to that. To give yourself give a little bit of self-coaching and, okay, this is how I can do it better next time, but also some self-compassion going, okay, that wasn't great. That's okay. It's part of being human. Let's move on and do it better.
Absolutely. Sometimes you win, sometimes you learn. So one of my favourite books, once again, from the man himself, John Maxwell. So let me just digress a little bit. So we're coming through this pandemic, and it just doesn't seem to be going away. It's, I think when it hit last March, when we all thought, yeah, give it 6 months, it'll be over and done with. By September, we'll be, back doing what it is that we're doing. And here we are looking at September the next year, and it's still going with no signs of moving through. Now, I've seen some real shifts in some of the leaders that I coach and that I work with in relation to the initial stages where they thought it was a temporary thing to where they are now, knowing that it's 100%, well, it's almost like it's going to be an ongoing permanency in relation to methods of work, for example. So what are some of the tips that you can give to leaders that are listening to this, that are struggling to come through or see an upside to what's happening with the pandemic? What are some of the, maybe a strategy or some tips or some hacks on how they can continue to work through this?
Yep. So there's a couple of different sides to this. There's them dealing with themselves and their own mindset, but there's also the how to guide their people through it. So with your permission, I'd sort of focus a little bit on the second one, if that's cool. One thing I've found through the pandemic is the reaction to looking after your people and keeping your people engaged and productive. From a wellness point of view, I've kind of seen two categories of managing it. So one of them is reactive. So that is if somebody is struggling, you realise they're struggling, they tell you they're struggling, providing support for them. So things like you would be familiar with EAP programs, that sort of stuff where there's like a counsellor on the phone. Now, while those reactive programs are vital and really, really important, they're not a solution, they're a reaction. So then the other side of it is proactive measures. Now, what I saw through a lot of the pandemic is one of the big upsides of the pandemic is leaders actually saw, okay, my staff are struggling. It's important for me to support them. So what I saw largely was leaders doing things like care packages for staff, where they'd get a box in the mail of, I don't know, maybe a soft toy or some chocolate or something, whatever, something. So care packages. Things like wellness calls and check-ins, things like online stuff like games nights or that sort of stuff. From a wellness kind of thing, things like offering yoga classes or meditation and that sort of stuff. So that's the kind of reactive stuff I saw. Now, again, while those things are good, do any of those get to the heart of the problem? And that's the biggest issue I found. So I think the thing that is still missing, and leaders are starting to cotton on to this, is that yes, all those things are great in showing people that they're part of a team, that their leaders care about them. But is it really getting to the heart of their issues? So the heart of their issues could be things like a parent who's exhausted because they're trying to work and homeschool their kids at the same time, or look after kids who may have been in daycare normally. Is it getting to the heart of, well, my staff are really concerned about the viability of their job ongoing, and they're concerned that in 12 months' time they're going to have a job. And it can be a range of things, because it does depend on industries and individual. The biggest thing I think that still needs to happen is that leaders pivot and go, okay, what is the core issue? How do I really find out what is the core issue of my staff, and what do I need to do as a good leader in order to help address that for them? And it is going to, as I said, it depends very much on the workplace and the individual employee, but that is what I think really needs to pivot.
Absolutely. And it's interesting you're talking about all those things that leaders identified and were able to work through, things like check-ins and whatnot. But one of the, as we got towards the end of last year, I started to challenge and stretch, without putting too much pressure on them, challenge and stretch some of the guys that I worked with, for example, in relation to how do we start developing our people? How do we start identifying leadership potential when someone is not necessarily within the same four walls as where we were operating? And that really opened up some eyes. And then all of a sudden coming into 2021, it's almost like this is permanent now, Tony. I no longer have my team in my office. We're doing a hybrid mix, and at any one time there's 30% of my team that might be in the office. So the challenges aren't going to go away. So I think what you've just provided there is some real key things to get to the root of the problem and try and identify some of those issues and try and walk with your team through that process. So, trivia nights and, Friday wines by Zoom just may not necessarily be the end all or the final part of the strategy. So when we talk about Jodie Woelkerling, what is the ultimate vision for you going forward from now?
I'm going to I'm going to sound a little bit almost idealistic, I think, in this. I really want to make a positive impact and a large-scale positive impact. So that is getting the voice out of how important this is and educating people and changing perspectives. So I wouldn't profess to say I'm somebody like a Simon Sinek, but you look at your Simon Sineks and how much impact he has, how much people actually listen and they've changed their perspectives. So I would be very happy if I got to kind of that sort of impact of a Simon Sinek, but that's kind of he's a really good example of what I would like, somebody who has really shifted perspectives by explaining very different concepts and very practical concepts in a way that people can really grasp, and he's made an enormous impact. So that's what I would like. It's a very large scale aim.
It's interesting when I talk with businesses or with HR departments. Often it's really hard for someone to put a quantification on a leadership coach and what value they ultimately bring. What's the return on investment? And I think it's always important that that there is a delivery of value, and every coach that I've spoken to on this particular podcast wants to make a difference, wants to make an impact, wants to create better leaders. And it's, that impact of, things like your company churn rates and employee turnover and increased productivity and, less unfair work hassles and less unfair dismissal claims and less bullying and harassment. And we can all talk about that. And so many times businesses accept that as a cost of doing business. And it frustrates me because give your people opportunity and to develop with someone who's an expert in the particular arena. You need inside mentoring, you need role modeling, but having that perspective from outside of the organization delivers value just handsomely to organizations. So I haven't met a coach yet that doesn't want to make an impact. So I'm glad that that
why would you do coaching if you didn't want to make an impact, really?
So many, and once again, I'm going to address something here because coaching is actually quite hard work, isn't it? Because you've got to stay present, you've got to stay in the moment, you've got to be focused on the other person, and part of our human nature is completely against all of those three things that I've just talked about. Staying present, we get distracted every time. Usually we're really self-centered individuals and humans as a general rule. So all of those three things, to stay focused, present, and in the moment with someone else that you're more concerned about, is a challenging thing. So for everyone that's listening that thinks coaching is really easy, it's not. So it's a skill set, and you've got to have a purpose.
I'll add something else to that, Tony. The other challenge of coaching is the most powerful coaching is when somebody finds their own answer. So the other thing with coaching is not to just constantly give people the answer. That it's more powerful if they find it themselves and they adopt it.
And it's about,
really
very much so. And It's about asking the right questions. So I always use the analogy, Jodie, that coaching is, the way I coach anyway, the way that I like to see it is, if someone feels that they're in the hole, I'm going to be jumping in that hole with them, right? So that I can get a really deep understanding of where they are. And then together, we're going to work together to get out of there. And, whereas a lot of other coaches put it forward that if you're in a hole, I'm going to stand on the outside and I'm going to lift you up. And, that may seem pleasant, but the most power comes from when you can ask the right questions and someone says, aha, now I understand. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I'm talking about. It's very easy just to jump in and give answers, and it's usually not the best way to do it.
People discount that. And, so some of the greatest joys that I get is when someone, you've planted a seed by asking the right questions, or that you've, taken someone on the journey, and then all of a sudden they come to you at the next coaching session and say, you won't believe what I've done. And then all of a sudden what they've done is everything that you've been trying to help them understand about themselves. And, the best thing I can hear from a client is that I've done this. It's, look at what I've done, because then, because once again, coaching is just about helping people see their way. And, it's not about the coaching often. So, but anyway, let's move on. So out of everything, Jodie, that you've accomplished over the last couple of years, what are you most proud of?
Probably, I'm going to be this becomes the opposite of what we were just talking about coaching. I'm going to go quite personal here. Taking myself from a position of most of my working life being successful in quotation marks, but being really in a state where stress was a major issue for me, and really quality of life, major issue in terms of quality of life. To take myself from that to a point of self-realisation and self-education, and obviously through formal education and that as well, take myself from that point, which has been the majority of my life, to pretty much being able to come at almost any challenge from a state of resilience and sure-footedness, if that makes sense. It doesn't mean life gets easier. It means your ability to actually deal with what comes along is better. And I think that's probably the biggest pride, as opposed to the coaching model. But taking myself from that situation, and that then does actually really, really seriously help my coaching, because I'm coming from that point of view.
You walk the talk.
Knowing that process.
You've worked with it yourself, which is fantastic. And it's always interesting, because I think in today's world we're seeing the concept of resilience getting talked about more and more, and it's front and center. And yet in the world we see so many people that have no resilience, that, for whatever reason, it could be the way they think, it could be their political point of view. And the minute something disrupts their own way of thinking, there's a reaction. And I find that if there was one characteristic that I would love to see more of, whether it's in our education systems, or whether it's in, the way that we're teaching our young people, the concept of resilience is just fundamental for me. It's the world is the world, and we need to teach our people that, the world's not going to agree with you all the time. It's actually going to hit you over the head every now and again. It's about how you deal and work with that. That's going to be the indicator of your greatest success. Now I already know the answer to this next question, Jodie. So is there anything that I haven't asked you that I should have asked you?
I would like to do a quick plug, if that's okay. I've got a book that I'm about to release. It'll probably come out in the next month to 2 months. Basically, it's called World Class Leadership, and it looks at some of the key patterns that I see in terms of cultural issues through businesses. So repeated issues with sort of case studies and explanations of how it shows up and what's the impact and all that sort of stuff. So if anybody's interested in the book, please, I'm not sure, Tony, if you give people ways of getting
absolutely.
in touch.
Whatever you tell me will be in the show notes.
Okay, so probably the easiest ways is either if you're on LinkedIn, just reach out to me through LinkedIn messaging, or you can email at info@jodiewoelkerling.com. And
excellent. So you've got your YouTube channel. We'll be sharing your Facebook as well. So the book's called World Class Leadership, and it's for senior executives determined to create a productive, collaborative, and ultimately profitable culture. So looking forward to seeing that come to reality. Jodie, before we go, it's going to be really remiss of me, at the beginning, before every podcast, I always try and make sure that I'm pronouncing the name 100%. And you shared a little something about your last name, Jodie Woelkerling.
Oh.
So for the benefit of the Today's Leader listeners out there, what does that mean?
So it's a surname that has German origins, and I had a person tell me some time ago that it means a little cloud. So,
which is
put that in the context.
Absolutely.
Of
so, Jodie Little Cloud, it's been an absolute pleasure having you today on the Today's Leader podcast. Thank you for investing in the leaders of today.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for having me on, Tony.